Hey y'all, it's Laura, and I am back with a Cocoa Vanilla Studios design team layout using these two adorable photos of one of our dogs, Strider. Now, Strider isn't with us anymore, but I wanted to document his absolute adoration for sleeping. He was an expert at sleeping. He could sleep on the floor, in a bed, on a chair, upside down, with his head hanging out. Didn't matter. The dog could sleep anywhere. And so I wanted to go ahead and document that with the Daydream collection because I thought it was perfect for these two photos. Now I'm going to be creating a modified grid layout today, and I am of course backing these with white paper first because it gives them a little highlight on your layout so they don't get lost amidst all of the paper layers. I do love to use a pattern paper background. I do it quite often, and so having that highlighted mat around my photos helps them to stand out and remain the focal point for the layout, no matter how many layers of pattern paper I add to it. Now, I knew I wanted to add a little hidden journaling to this layout. Because Strider isn't with us anymore, I wanted to put in a few words about him and this last year that we had him, but I don't necessarily want that to be part of the first image you get on the layout because it's not an uplifting and happy memory necessarily, but I do want to include it because these stories need to be told as well, and I think those deep emotional ties we have to our pets are super important, and documenting them is just as necessary as those happy moments. Now, my product focus for this layout was to use the Happy Place cut apart sheet, and I really love all of the cut aparts in this collection. There's not only some 3x4 cards, one of which I'm using on the grid and one of which I use for my journaling spot. There's also lots of little bits and pieces and long 12-inch strips you can use as layers or banners, or as I end up using it as a footer at the bottom of my layout. Now, you may be wondering what size layout I'm working on here because this is a very small piece of paper. The reason for that is I'm trying to figure out how I want to get my photos positioned before I start enlarging the layout to 12 by 12. It is a 12 by 12, by the way. I just want to get a feel for it before I start adding those extra layers because it can sometimes be kind of overwhelming when you have a 12 by 12 space to work in. So quite often I will break it down to a smaller space, confine myself to that space, and then leave a little bit of open area around the photos. And so that's the technique that I'm using here. Now, this wood grain is absolutely stunning. I love a good wood grain. And so that is going to be my background, but I am going to use this gorgeous yellow stripe as a frame around the striped paper. Now, I have a small issue in that I have to hoard every little bit of my Cocoa Vanilla collections, and so I'm not going to allow that section of yellow paper to hide behind the multicolored stripe. No, I am going to gut this paper and save that for later because why waste it? It's so pretty. So that's my plan, to save a little bit of paper. Is it hoarding? Maybe a little bit. Little bit, you know, but I'm okay with that. Just means I get to make more layouts with this gorgeous collection. So now that I have my photos on a plan, I'm going to go ahead and tape down this center section to my background. Now, I'm not going to put it completely in the dead center middle because I think it's more interesting to have it up just a little bit higher or down a little bit lower. I think it's just kind of neat to see a layout that isn't dead center middle, because when you first look at a layout, when you first look at a piece of paper, at least in the US, you typically look in the top left. That's where you find the title, that's where you find a photo, that's where you find the most important information. So quite often I tend to lean towards the top of the page with my photos for that reason, so that the photos are the first thing that catches your eye. So this was feeling a little bit flat to me, so I'm going to go ahead and cut up some paper strips and use some of the manufacturing strips to create some layers here at the top and the bottom, just the top and the bottom, add a little vertical flow to this layout and just make it feel a little bit more dynamic. Those layers will give the impression of depth without having to add foam, without having to add height underneath of the photos. That said, this is quite the chunky layout, as you will soon see. Now, here is the manufacturing strip. You may not know this, but on the back of the manufacturing strip, there is a small piece of the pattern that is on the opposite side of the page. And I sometimes cut those out and use those in my layering just like this. And so that's what I'm doing here is I'm using those little manufacturing strip cutouts and just tucking them in above that polka dot paper. End up going with the blue and the kind of reddish pink because I just thought that they looked nice. So now I'm going to go ahead and get this grid sorted out. I don't want it to be a perfect grid. I want it to be a little varied, a little interesting, a more modified style of grid. I'm going to try a couple of layering things here. This was part of the cut apart as well. I fussy cut out the rainbows. And then I have some labels that were also part of the cut apart as well. Is this good times? So yeah, we're just going to create some clusters up here on the front of this envelope because I don't want the envelope to be completely blank. That just seems sort of boring. And at this point, I thought maybe it needed a title, but there's already 2 large sections of words on the page. And then I decided, it doesn't need this. I end up using this for another layout this month. So come back and check on the 29th to see that one. But for embellishing, I wanted to keep it fairly simple and fairly segmented. So we'll have clusters in small areas. I've got a floral here. I've got the good times in the label. That's going to be one cluster. I've got some rainbows down at the bottom. It will have a word phrase added to it and a couple of small things. That's a cluster. There will be 2 small segmented areas of embellishment that are completely separate from the photos, and those will be clusters. And I think by doing this, it takes advantage of the space that you have, and by keeping them separate, it keeps it from being too overwhelming on the page. It will also help that I am leaving so much blank space around the outside and keeping my embellishing to the center. So I'm going to go ahead and back both of these photos with a little bit of this dotted paper, which I am a huge fan of a random polka dot. Black and white is my favorite, so I was very excited to see that paper in the collection. I do try a couple of things first, but we'll come back to that dotted paper because it is delicious. So keeping it a little bit different though. I don't want every square to have the same thing. I don't want this to be a true grid where everything is in square format. There's going to be a couple different sizes to the clusterings, a couple different shapes to the photos. So the photos are both squares, but the way they're decorated, they do look like different shapes. I have some rectangles on here already. I have the square photos, and then I'm going to soften that with some rounded shapes in just a moment. Because I do find that if I leave a layout a little bit too linear, that I don't enjoy it quite as much as if I allow myself to add a little bit of whimsy to it. So that's how I see my personal style, is a whimsical linear. I do like my layouts to have some structure, some foundation to them, but at the same time I want to soften the hard angles with rounded items like flair and things like hearts and circles, and even hexagons can break up the square format of a layout and make it a little bit softer, a little bit sweeter, especially if you're scrapping photos that have that sweet tone to them. So here's where I'm going to bring in some of that flair, and I'm going to end up using 3 on this page because the way that I scrapbook is either the layout's going to be completely flat or the layout is going to have some chunk, and I tend to go all out one way or the other. So if I'm going to add 1 piece of flair, I might as well add 3 because this is going to be a chunky layout in my scrapbook album. What this does is it kind of evens things out when you're flipping through it so that not every page has foam or chunky embellishments. Some of them are flat, and that kind of evens it out so my album doesn't get too chunky overall. And I don't do these super chunky layouts super often, so I do enjoy them when I have the opportunity. So now that I've gotten 2 pieces of flair on here, I'm going to go ahead and bring in some bits and pieces from the ephemera pack, namely these hearts on the left side, and then I'll bring in some rainbows over on the right side, and those 2 clusters will balance each other out because on their opposite ends of the layout. And I will be popping up all of those onto some foam because, like I said, go big or go home. If I'm going to have a chunky layout, let's go all in on the chunky layout, add some foam for depth and dimension behind those rainbows and hearts, and then we'll have our flair buttons to soften up the hard angles of this very linear layout. Another thing I'm keeping in mind while I'm scrapping this layout, and the reason I've chosen this wood grain for the background, these photos are very, very neutral. My dog is white and brown. Both of the two things he's sleeping on, one is a reclining chair, the other is a dog bed, are neutral colors. So I'm not going to be able to draw a lot of color inspiration from the photos themselves, but that also gives me the freedom to use whatever colors I like. I do, however, want to ground the background of this layout with this wood grain that ties in the photos so they make sense and it's not just an explosion of pastels with brown and white photos. It just helps to tie them in to make sense of the layout as a whole, and again, like I said, ground the whole design with that wood grain. So it kind of looks like a window into the layout, as if you're looking through a frame. And that's kind of what I was going for. So here's a little foam pieces I'm adding behind the hearts. This will help them stand up and have a little bit of a shadow, which is a really nice dynamic look and adds some depth to the layouts, makes it feel like a shadow box. And I really, really enjoy that. I did use some varying clustering here. I've got small, large, then small hearts. Threes are very interesting to the eye, as are a variety of sizes. I considered using these little pillow hearts, and I could have snuck a couple on here, but I decided because I'd gone for the flare, I should stick to the flare, and I'm glad I did, because I think too many more hearts probably would have been a bit much. So here I am adding that strip to the bottom that also came from the cut apart sheet, and then we'll create a cluster in the bottom right corner as well, just to help move the eye all the way through the layout to the end. So we've got our photos up in the top left, starting in the top left. That's where your eye begins. As it moves through the layout, I want to bring it all the way to completion at the bottom right corner. So that's where I will add a small cluster with another piece of flare. Because like I said, go big or go home. But to make these little hearts a little bit more interesting, I'm grabbing a couple of word strips and fishtailing them, then putting them on the two small hearts just for a bit of interest. And then we're going to bring in some sequins. I am a big fan of adding tiny details onto my layout. I like to see it as adding the fine details to a drawing. You can draw the larger shapes, but you add in those shadows and those little curvatures in a face or in the shape of a tree, an individual leaf, because those tiny details are really important to making the picture or the layout feel complete. And for me, that comes in many forms. Sometimes I use small stickers like these ones that I'm sticking on now, these little hearts, and I'm going to add those around all of my clusters, but I'm also going to bring in some sequins because I think adding a little bit of bling can never hurt. It always can help a layout, in my opinion. And this is what I call scattering. This is adding those tiny, tiny details all around the layout before I come in with some splatters to finish it off at the end. Now, some of these leaves look very pink on camera, but in person they're iridescent. So they kind of change between pink and yellow and clear, and they don't show up quite this pink on the actual layout. So I have to say, it was kind of surprising to me when I was editing this video to see those pop as so pink on the video. There's also some beautiful little gold circles in this mix, and this came with the Daydream collection as well, and I was really excited to see sequins in this collection because I'm a big fan of sequins. They are the perfect scattering details to add to a layout. So I'm going to add these all around. I will adhere those with just some simple drying clear glue, and they'll be good to go. So now that I have those all glued down, I'm going to add this little "Oh Happy Day" here underneath of my rainbows just to fill in that small gap, and a little bit of journaling here on this label. And again, what I'm putting on the outside of the layout is just talking about how much Strider loves to sleep, and here inside the pocket I will put further journaling that maybe isn't as cheerful and thoughtful or funny and clever as I'd like to think that I am. Coming in with some Nuvo for some controlled splattering, so I'm using this in the place of enamel dots, and I like using Nuvo because I can make very small, fine controlled splattering. So if you're uncomfortable with using the ink splatters that I'm about to use in just a minute, you can come in with something like Nuvo and you can completely control where that splatter lands. But once I've added those dotted all around the clusters, I'm going to come in with some gold ink spray to splatter just a little bit more, and I really love the way this pops on the wood grain, as you will see in the detail photos at the end, as well as on the Cocoa Vanilla blog at cocoavanilla.com.au to see more information information. Now, once this splattering is done, I do realize I need to add to the bottom right here and just put together a small cluster that helps to pull your eye to the end, and so you go all the way through the layout, because there's a lot going on in the center of the layout, and this helped guide your eye all the way through to the end. So I've added a little too funny, because he does love to sleep, let me tell ya, and a quick flare, and this one's complete. Until next time, bye!